I always believed I understood the shape of my life, its limits, its struggles, the quiet routines I built to survive. I thought everything I earned with scraped knuckles and sleepless nights. So when my grandfather looked at me with that strange, almost knowing smile, I didn't realize my entire world was about to tilt. It happened in a single moment, so casual, it almost felt cruel. He spoke as if I'd always known, as if the truth had been sitting in front of me my whole life. But I hadn't known. Not even close. Because what he revealed didn't just change my future, it exposed the past. It exposed the lies, the people who pretended to care, and the ones who made sure I stayed small, silent, and blind. Suddenly, the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like an afterthought made terrible, perfect sense. And the moment I realized who had kept that secret from me, and why, something inside me shifted. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter. Sharper. The kind of feeling that doesn't explode. It waits. I didn't know that hidden money could uncover hidden motives. I didn't know that a trust fund could unravel a family. And I certainly didn't know how far I would go once I learned the truth. But you're about to. Because the moment he asked that question, everything I thought I knew began to crack. And the real story, the one they tried hardest to bury, finally started to surface. Before everything unraveled, my life looked painfully ordinary from the outside, steady, predictable, small in the way people politely describe a life that never seemed to stretch beyond its edges. I worked long days as an assistant at a mid-sized accounting firm, the kind of place where fluorescent lights hummed louder than the people. I rented a modest apartment on the third floor of a building that smelled like old books and lemon cleaner, and most nights I cooked simple meals while listening to podcasts about people whose lives felt far more dramatic than mine. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly. But I wasn't seen either. Not at work, where my contributions slipped quietly under other people's names. Not in my social circle, where I was the dependable friend, the one who remembered birthdays but rarely had her own celebration. Not even in my family, where I was the sweet one, the quiet one, the one who didn't cause trouble and therefore didn't demand attention. It was easier, I guess, to believe the narrative others had written for me, that I was ordinary, that my future would be built brick by brick through hard work and modest expectations. I had grown used to the idea that nothing in my life would come without a fight, and even then, I might only get scraps. Still, I tried to find beauty in my routine. Morning coffee on the balcony before the city woke. Weekend thrift store hunts for books with handwritten notes in the margins. Late-night calls with my best friend, who always insisted I deserved more than I settled for. But beneath all of that, beneath the routines and the quiet acceptance, there was always a subtle, unshakable feeling that something in my life didn't add up. A puzzle piece was missing, though I didn't know which one, or where to look. It showed up in little moments. Like the way my grandfather would watch me sometimes, a softness in his eyes wrapped in something heavier, regret maybe, or guilt. Or the way my father always changed the subject when finances came up, as if money was a dangerous topic I had no right to touch. Or the vague comments from relatives who hinted I had no idea how lucky I was, though they never explained what they meant. I told myself I was imagining things, that family had quirks, and I was overthinking, that nothing in my life was remarkable enough to hide. But the truth, what they had hidden from me for years, wasn't small at all. It was massive, life-changing, and it had been wrapped in silence and sealed with the kind of deceit that only comes from people who claim to love you. I didn't know it then, but the quiet frustration I carried wasn't just about work or friendships or feeling invisible. It was a symptom of what had been kept from me, a truth that should have been mine long before I was old enough to understand its value. And if there was one thing I didn't realize yet, it was this. People who hide something that big will do almost anything to keep it buried. I was walking through my life half-blind, thinking my struggles were normal, unaware that the ground beneath me was already cracking. All it would take was one casual question from my grandfather, a single sentence dropped into an ordinary day, to expose everything they never wanted me to know. And once the truth surfaced, nothing about my ordinary life would ever be the same again. When my grandfather asked that question, how do you spend your $3.4 million trust fund? The world didn't just pause. It rearranged itself. Everything I thought I knew shifted, like someone had tilted the floor beneath me. I remember staring at him, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a joke, some strange attempt at bonding. But he didn't laugh. He just looked at me in that quiet way of his, as if he'd finally said something he'd been holding onto for too long. The ride home afterward was a blur. The city lights smeared across the windows like streaks of paint, and my heart slammed against my ribs the entire way. I tried to convince myself I'd misunderstood him. Maybe he'd mix me up with one of my cousins. Maybe he meant something else. Anything else. But later that night, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and my phone open to the Notes app, trying to make sense of his words. Trust fund. $3.4 million.
Mine.
None of it connected to the life I had lived, the life of scraping by, counting coupons, and stretching paychecks. I should have called him. I should have asked, but something stopped me. A whisper of instinct. A warning. Something inside me said, don't ask him yet. Find the truth yourself. And that was the moment everything began to unravel. The next morning at work, I couldn't focus. Every spreadsheet blurred together. Every email felt pointless. My mind kept gravitating back to the same question. If the trust fund was real, why didn't I know about it? Why would something that enormous be hidden from me? The answer should have terrified me. Instead, it made me angry. An anger that started slow, like a tremor deep in my chest, but grew stronger every hour. That evening, I finally worked up the courage to search for my own financial records. I logged into everything I could think of, bank accounts, retirement accounts, anything. But there was nothing unusual, nothing hinting at millions hidden somewhere out of sight. Which meant someone had intentionally kept it from me. Someone with access. Someone with a reason. And that realization was what pushed me to visit my parents' house the next day. My childhood home looked the same as it always had, neat, polished, too perfect in the way my mother insisted on keeping it. I walked through the door, and for the first time in my life, I felt like an intruder. Not a daughter, not family, but a stranger walked into a place she thought she knew. My mother greeted me with her usual tight-lipped smile, and my father barely looked up from the news playing on his tablet. Nothing seemed different. Nothing gave away the secret they had kept buried for years. And maybe that was the most shocking part, how effortlessly they could pretend. I sat down with them in the living room, and for a moment, I almost backed out. But then my mother asked, offhandedly, "How's work?" in that dismissive tone she always used, the one that made my job feel like a hobby, like a placeholder for the life she expected me to live. And something inside me snapped. "I saw Grandpa yesterday," I said. Silence. A flicker in my father's eyes. A tightening in my mother's jaw. "And he asked me," I continued, careful, slow, "how I spend my $3.4 million trust fund." That was when the room changed. It was subtle, but I saw it. Saw the way my mother's face drained of color. Saw how my father sat up straighter. How the air thickened. They didn't hide their reaction well at all. My mother was the first to speak. "He said that." Her voice cracked. "Yes." My father cleared his throat. "He's getting older," he muttered. "You know how he is. Confuses things." It was such a sloppy excuse that anger bloomed in my chest like fire. "Is it true?" I asked. No softness. No hesitation. My mother looked away. My father rubbed his face. The quiet stretched on, until it became its own confession. And that was when I realized something crucial. They weren't scrambling to protect me. They were scrambling to protect themselves. That night, I left their house without answers, but with something far more valuable. Suspicions. Dark ones. Ones that refused to let me sleep. If they were hiding the truth, then there had to be records somewhere. Paper trails. Legal documents. Something they overlooked, assuming I'd never go looking. Over the next week, I dove headfirst into research, financial laws, inheritance rules, trust fund guidelines. And the deeper I dug, the clearer one thing became. If a trust fund existed in my name, Someone had to be the trustee. Someone had the power to access it. Someone could manipulate it. Someone close. And that's when I remembered the odd behavior. The hush-hush conversations, the sudden topic changes whenever money was discussed, the way relatives always looked at me with an expression I never understood until now. Pity. Pity for the girl who didn't know she was being robbed. Fueled by anger and sleepless nights, I decided to confront the one person who would tell me the truth, the attorney my grandfather had always used for family matters. I made an appointment under the guise of estate planning advice. The receptionist didn't question me. My last name carried weight in that quiet, polished office. The attorney, a man in his 60s with silver hair and tired eyes, welcomed me with polite professionalism. But the moment I mentioned my grandfather's name, something shifted behind his expression. I asked one question. Just one. Is there a trust fund in my name? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, like someone finally opening a door they'd been leaning against for too long. Yes, he said. The word hit me like a physical blow. Your grandfather established it when you were a child. You were supposed to access it when you turned 21. 21. I was 28. Then why? My voice broke. Why didn't I get access? He hesitated. I looked at the door, lowered his voice. Your parents requested extensions. Multiple times. A cold wave rushed through me. Why would they? They claimed, he said carefully, that you were financially irresponsible, unprepared, immature, and that the funds could endanger you. I nearly laughed. Me? The girl who budgeted down to the last dollar? The girl who had never asked them for anything? I forced myself to stay calm. And you believed them? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence told me everything. He slid a folder across the table. I shouldn't show you this, he whispered. But I've been waiting for years for you to come. Inside the folder was a set of documents, signatures, requests, statements written in my parents' handwriting. Lies stacked on top of lies. My mother's elegant cursive detailing my irresponsible spending habits. My father's firm signature stated that I was emotionally unstable and not fit to handle finances. I felt sick. But beneath the nausea was something sharper. Something powerful. They had stolen from me. And not just money, years of opportunity, freedom, choices I never got to make. But as I kept reading, the story grew darker. The trust fund had been accessed, withdrawn, bit by bit, by someone who had signed as the trustee, someone who had legal control. My father. My breath caught. My fingers shook. My vision blurred. He hadn't just hidden the money. He had used it, spent it, exploited it, for years. And suddenly everything made sense. The new car he bought when the dealership ran a deal, the renovations to the house, the vacations they claimed were paid for with my mother's office bonuses. It wasn't their money. It was mine. Stolen from me, while they let me work minimum wage jobs in college, let me struggle, let me think I wasn't worth investing in. My life wasn't just small because of circumstances. It was small because they made sure it stayed that way. The attorney looked at me with something close to sympathy. You need to decide, he said quietly. Do you want to reclaim what's yours or stay silent? There was no choice. Silence was no longer an option. I left with copies of everything. And as I walked out of the building into the fading afternoon light, something inside me hardened into a promise. They had built their lives off my trust fund. They had shaped my future with lies. They had underestimated me. And now they were going to see exactly what happened when the daughter they kept small finally learned the truth. What I did next would tear apart everything they'd built. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the consequences. I was hungry for them. The day everything came to a head didn't feel dramatic at first. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of calm that only exists right before a storm breaks open. I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. No shaking hands. No doubt. No fear. Only purpose. For the first time, the anger inside me wasn't scattered or chaotic. It was focused. Sharpened. Ready. I had spent days preparing, gathering every document, every signature, every financial statement that proved exactly what my parents had done. I organized everything into neatly labeled folders, one set for the bank, one for the authorities, and one for my grandfather. And then there was the final folder, the one I hesitated to even look at. The folder I would hand to my parents. The one they would never see coming. I remember driving to their house feeling strangely calm, almost detached, like I was watching myself from a distance. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the wind felt colder than it should have been. It matched the weight in my chest. When I walked in without knocking, they were both at the kitchen table. My father reading the news, my mother scrolling through her phone. It looked like any normal morning, but it wasn't. Not anymore. I placed the folders on the table with a soft thud. They looked up. Confusion flickered first. Then something else, fear. They recognized the attorney's letterhead. My mother was the first to speak, her voice brittle. "Where did you get that?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "From the person who helped you steal from me." My father's jaw tightened. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I said. And I did. For the first time, every memory, every odd comment, every moment that never made sense suddenly clicked into place. "You kept me struggling, working myself to exhaustion, while you lived off money that never belonged to you." He stood abruptly, but I didn't flinch. I held his gaze. "Sit down." To my shock, he did. I opened the first folder and slid it toward him. Bank statements showing the withdrawals, transfers, signatures, everything. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "We did it to protect you," she whispered, but even she couldn't seem to believe the words as they came out. "No," I said quietly. "You did it to protect yourselves. And your lifestyle. And your lies." My father's face hardened. "You can't prove intent." I almost smiled. "You're right," I said as I opened the second folder. "Which is why I asked someone else to help me." That was the moment my grandfather stepped into the kitchen. And the silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Thick, suffocating, electric with shock. My mother's eyes widened. My father's breath hitched. But neither of them could look him in the eye. He said nothing at first. He didn't need to. His presence was the confrontation they had spent years trying to avoid. He sat beside me, gently placing a hand on my arm. "I had a feeling," he said softly, "but I never imagined it was this bad." My father tried to speak, but my grandfather raised his hand. "No more lies. Not today." The authority in his voice made the room feel smaller. My parents looked trapped, cornered animals with nowhere left to hide. Then my grandfather looked at me, and his expression softened. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I should have made sure you always knew the truth." Hearing those words almost broke something inside me. Almost. But the anger held steady, anchoring me in place. "I know everything now," I said. "And I know what I'm doing next." I slid the final folder toward my parents. This one wasn't just evidence. It was the culmination of everything they had done, compiled, signed, notarized. My new trustee documents. My legal filings. A detailed accounting of every cent they stole. "You're going to return everything you took," I said, my voice steady. "Every withdrawal. Every expense. Every dollar." My father's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. "We don't have that kind of money anymore." "I know," I replied. "That's why the house is already flagged for evaluation. Your assets, too." My mother let out a choked sob. "You wouldn't do that to us." A calm washed over me, cold and absolute. "You did it to me first." My father slammed his fist on the table, but the sound felt hollow. "Empty. You're ruining your own family." "We were never a family," I said. "You made sure of that the moment you decided your comfort was worth more than my future." The room erupted into overlapping voices, pleading, denying, bargaining. But I didn't hear any of it. My eyes stayed fixed on them, unblinking, unmoved. Then my grandfather delivered the final blow, his voice steady as steel. "If you don't comply, I will testify on her behalf. And every lawyer in the city knows what my word is worth." Silence fell again, heavy, suffocating, irreversible. My parents broke. I watched it happen in real time. The realization hit them like a wave they couldn't outrun. They weren't losing money. They were losing control. Losing the person they thought they could manipulate forever. My father lowered his head into his hands. My mother was crying, quietly, hopelessly. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. Like I was finally stepping out of a shadow I never knew I'd been living in. As I stood to leave, my mother whispered my name, small, fragile, desperate. I didn't turn back. I walked out the door with my grandfather beside me, the weight of the moment settling deep in my bones. The sky had finally opened, rain pouring down in sheets, cold and relentless. But the storm felt right. Honest. Cleansing. As we reached the car, my grandfather looked at me with a mix of sadness and pride. Are you sure you're ready for everything that comes next? I took a long breath, letting the rain soak through my clothes, grounding me. I'm not just ready, I said. I've been waiting my whole life. And I knew the cost of my revenge would be high, but the cost of silence would have been much higher. The real fallout was just beginning, and the consequences would change all of us forever. In the days that followed the confrontation, everything moved with a strange, surreal clarity. My parents didn't fight back, at least not in the ways I expected. There were no dramatic courtroom battles, no desperate attempts to twist the truth. Instead, there was quiet compliance. Silent phone calls. Documents signed without argument. The resignation of people who knew the walls had finally closed in. Maybe it was my grandfather's presence. Maybe it was the weight of undeniable proof. Or maybe they simply recognized that, for once, I wasn't backing down. Within weeks, the trust was fully transferred to me, legally, openly, irreversibly. Investigators traced every unauthorized transaction, and their assets were liquidated piece by piece to repay the debt. Watching their world crumble wasn't satisfying in the way movies make revenge look. It wasn't explosive or triumphant. It was gradual, quiet, and strangely hollow. But it was just. I moved into a small place outside the city while everything settled, a house with creaking floors and a backyard big enough to breathe in. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living inside someone else's expectations. Money didn't erase the betrayal. It didn't rebuild trust. But it gave me something far more important, a foundation that belonged solely to me. The nights were the hardest at first. Silence has a way of magnifying thoughts, and mine spiraled between anger, relief, and something deeper, grief. Not for the money, not for the years lost, but for the family I thought I had. It hit me slowly, painfully, that my revenge hadn't just exposed what they'd done, it had exposed what they'd always been. I hadn't destroyed a family. I had uncovered the truth of one that was already fractured long before I ever questioned it. My grandfather visited often during those early weeks. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat together, without saying a word. One afternoon, he apologized again. Not for the money, but for not protecting me sooner. I didn't know how to tell him. I didn't blame him. He had given me honesty when no one else would. And honesty, real, brutal honesty, became the cornerstone of my healing. There was no rush of triumph, no cinematic celebration when the trust fund reappeared under my control. Instead, there was a simple, overwhelming sense of reclamation. My life was finally mine. The choices, the future, the path ahead, it all belonged to me in a way it never had before. But revenge has a strange way of echoing long after the moment passes. People like to imagine that getting payback feels clean, sharp, final. But all I felt was changed. Not broken. Not bitter. Just different. Like a layer of naivety had peeled away, leaving someone who understood not only the cost of betrayal, but the cost of reclaiming your power. I expected anger to linger, but instead, something else surprised me. Clarity. I realized how many people live their whole lives in the shadows of other people's control, voices muted, potential stifled, truths buried. My story wasn't rare. It was just hidden like so many others. The only difference was that I finally refused to stay quiet. I began using the money not to erase the past, but to build something new. I enrolled in courses I'd always dreamed of taking. I invested in small local businesses run by people who reminded me of who I used to be, overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. I learned how to live without apologizing for taking up space. As for my parents, we drifted into silence. A silence that wasn't angry or dramatic, just inevitable. They had gambled my future away to protect their comfort, and in the end, they lost both. I didn't need apologies from them anymore. I didn't need their validation. I didn't even need their remorse. What I needed was peace. And finally, I had it. But even now, when I think back to that moment at the kitchen table, the folders, the shock, the confrontation, I realize something important. My revenge wasn't in the documents. It wasn't in the legal filings. It wasn't even in the money returned to me. My revenge was in reclaiming the version of myself they never wanted me to become. Someone who questioned. Someone who demanded truth. Someone who refused to live small. And here's the part no one really talks about. Revenge doesn't end when justice is delivered. It ends when you stop letting the betrayal define you. I'm not the same woman I was when this began. I'm stronger,
Sharper.
and far less willing to accept silence as love. So if you're listening, if you've ever been betrayed, manipulated, or kept small by the people who were supposed to protect you, ask yourself this. Is your revenge about tearing them down or finally building yourself up? Because sometimes the most powerful form of payback isn't what you take from them. It's what you finally give to yourself.